For many of us, defence is invisible. As we go about our lives, we've rarely had cause to think about it, and that's a good thing. But geopolitical tension and new technology has changed what the job entails, how it's best done, and the tools that are used. Today, we answer the big question, do we need to think differently about defence?
One of the reasons that you don't have to think about defence is because deterrence is working.
It's quite a widespread industry and one that has been historically very important for the UK economy and for growth.
It's not just military, it's economics, societal, information, all of these things are in the bucket of security.
We're at a point now where I think if we can get this right between government and the private sector side, there's a real opportunity to drive that agenda forward.
Unless we sort of move out and try these things, we'll never get that innovation and we'll never know.
Hello and welcome to the Green Room by Deloitte. I'm Annie Wong and I'm joined by my co-host Lizzie Alston. Defence is becoming more important and more visible to all of us. But do we really understand the role it plays in our lives? Spending on defence has increased globally every year for the last decade, and here in the UK, it's been identified as a key area for growth. So what are the possibilities and opportunities for the defence sector and the society it protects? Today, we answer the big question, do we need to think differently about defence?
Today, we are joined by Rachel Ellerhoos, Director General of the Royal United Services Institute. Hi, Rachel.
Hello.
And also by Duncan Farrow-Smith, Chief Strategy Officer and Leader of the Defence Practice at Deloitte UK. Hi, Duncan.
Good afternoon.
Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. And sort of to get started today, can we have a chat about the role that defence plays in all of our lives? And also perhaps share a little bit of your experience of the defence sector through your career. Rachel, would you like to start?
Absolutely. Well, thanks for inviting me on. So I find myself in a very unique period right now as an American in London, but I've spent the majority of my life living and working in Europe, most recently in NATO. I moved here and took up the Director General post at RUSI in January of this year, previously again at NATO in the US delegation, and then prior to that a long career in the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon and in the think tank world. I also worked in your Ministry of Defense, so I feel like I've been sort of inside the tent on how UK defense works. I love to talk about defense, and I'm glad that it's become trendy finally after several decades. But being serious, people don't think about defense because it's something that they've taken for granted, I would say, for at least the last 50 years. For the last 50 years, we've been pretty fortunate to have a relative peace in the post-World War II and Cold War period. In the case of the UK, that was very much nested in a national defense that was supplemented by regional and bilateral relationships, for example, with the United States or with Germany, and then supplemented on top through those international organizations like the United Nations, NATO, and at one point the European Union, and now the UK is trying to get back into that relationship, in particular on the defense side with the EU. But we're finding that increasingly threats are changing, the people around the table are changing, and the conversation around defense is changing. And so I hope we'll talk a little bit about that today, but increasingly people do have to think about the role of defense in their lives. Defense is not something that happens on the battlefield. Increasingly it can happen when you're waiting at the airport. I think, across Europe just this week, people are experiencing cyber attacks that are affecting their flights. That's, although we haven't attributed that attack yet, it could be malign influence. So defense is something that's coming to us.
Duncan, what about yourself, the role of defence and a bit about yourself?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Rachel has said. In terms of the last 50 years, we've been in a very kind of benign period, and that's something we've all enjoyed. And what defence is here to do, and it's been invisible for us, is really to ensure our prosperity and way of life in the UK. But it is responsible for a lot of innovation that we all use day to day, GPS, satellites, microwaves, duct tape and the like. So there's a lot of innovation that's come out of that sector that we all kind of use day to day. My own personal experience, I've worked in the sector coming on 30 years now. Started off working on a project for Chelsea Barracks, which was coming through a PFI initiative at the time. If you go down to Chelsea, you'll see the housing, the posh housing that exists there nowadays. I then spent a bit of time in the Treasury when I worked on the Defence Industrial Strategy, the 2005 Lord Drayson version, and we've just had the 2025 version, 20 years on from that. And off the back of that, spent quite a bit of time working with the public sector and the private sector on the implementation of the industrial strategy in the UK, but also fortunately I got to do similar in Australia, who were having similar issues and similar opportunities around their defence industrial strategy.
It's interesting, you both mention defence being relatively benign, invisible. Rachel, your point around it not happening at the battlefield but happening at the airport. I think it would be really helpful, particularly for some of our listeners who don't work in defence, aren't close to it at all, to just maybe shine a light a little bit more on some of the lesser known areas of defence, or any common misconceptions about defence that you would like to myth bust for us.
Okay, well, I'll start, and I'll start close to home. I'll start with NATO. You know, in the current environment, I get a lot of questions about NATO and what some people call NATO expansion. But I think it's important for listeners to remember that NATO is a defensive alliance. And NATO basically builds up a nuclear arsenal, a cyber arsenal, ways of operating to deter attacks and then to defend if that line is crossed. So, you know, if you don't bother NATO, you really don't have anything to worry about. So the air incursions that we saw in recent weeks, that was Russia entering NATO airspace and challenging NATO allies. I cannot think of an incident in recent times when NATO has done the same in Russian territory. So one of the reasons that you don't have to think about defense is because deterrence is working. That Article 5 guarantee that says an attack against one is attack against all is something that is so strong that when an adversary is sitting there and thinking about whether to attack a NATO country, they're making that calculation about whether the benefits will outweigh the costs. And because of deterrence, the hope is, and I think, you know, the proof of the last few decades has been that they have calculated that the costs are greater than the benefits. So it's not worth going down that route. Now, another important point, and I think Duncan alluded to this in his opening statement, is then the Russians have learned, and other adversaries have learned, to operate below that threshold of armed conflict and to move into that hybrid space where it's harder to say a boot crossed across a border, or to say who's responsible, or to say there was significant loss of life. So we have a cyber attack, it's fixed within hours, nobody notices, everybody moves on. But when that happens 10, 15 times, and each time it gets more bold and challenging, do we just sit back and accept it? So I think those are the questions people should be trying to understand. How defense and a good defense can protect them as they go about their everyday lives, because there's no sense of security or ability to grow either as a person or a corporation or an institution unless you feel secure.
Duncan, anything else you'd add to that?
Again, building up what Rachel said, over the last 50 years, we've seen a kind of a decline in the number of, or the size of the armed forces in the UK over that time, since the kind of 1950s really. In 1990s, we had about 300,000 armed forces personnel. That reduced to about 200,000 in 2005, and we're back down to around 140,000 in the UK. So it's been on quite a decline. On the other hand, something people might not kind of appreciate is there are about 500,000 jobs. So 1 in 60 jobs in the UK is in the defence industry. Around 70% of those are outside of the southeast of England. So it's quite a widespread industry and one that has been historically very important for the UK economy and for growth. And we'll maybe come back to that later on.
It'll be really interesting to touch on that later, actually, and talking about sort of the roles which people may not even think of, which are in the sort of the broader defence ecosystem, I guess. I mean, you sort of alluded, Rachel, earlier about some things like cyber attacks. We're seeing more news of this sort of thing and mentions of national cyber security. I wonder if you can share some of the key ways in which defence has changed during the time that you've been in the sector and how they've affected the way the sector works.
Maybe I'll mention three. The first is I explained this concept of deterrence and how we've tried to deter an enemy attack through denial. So denying them access or signaling punishment if you cross that line. I think the nature of deterrence is changing. I think now we've realized that we can't protect against every attack. So you'll hear a term, deterrence by resilience, which basically means we know we'll be hit, but we can bounce back. And so I think the concept of resilience in society and throughout the defense establishment and even in the private sector is becoming a really important aspect of defense. The second is that the nature of the challenges is not just, tanks and soldiers. So it really is a cross-government endeavor. At RUSI, we have contracts with the Home Office, the Foreign Office, the Met Police, because we're looking at organized crime and the link between organized crime and disinformation and meddling and hybrid attacks. So it's all kind of intertwined. So you can't just turn to the Ministry of Defense for solutions. And that brings me to my third point, and I'm sure Duncan has experienced this firsthand, is the role of the private sector. In your opening comments, you mentioned microwaves, duct tapes, GPS. Now it's going the other way. Increasingly, we're seeing innovation that was developed not in the defense establishment, but in the private sector being looked at by defense actors, and they're asking themselves, how can I use this? Yeah. So things like Starlink, and I'm sure you have other examples, AI-empowered battlefield intelligence is helping the Ukrainians. So we're seeing private sector actors having a seat at the table and being part of these solutions.
Duncan, can you share a bit more about that? Sort of some of the examples that you're seeing of the sort of collaboration between private and public?
Yeah, and what's interesting that underpins that, if you look at where spend has gone into kind of the private sector over the last number of decades, there used to be much more in commercial, i.e. non-specialist defence or A&D organisations. Something in the order of 70% of the spend would go on to commercial organisations, which were not just focused on defence, they were producing goods and services for dual use or multiple use. And that innovation is what we kind of keyed off. Over time, that has declined. And so now it's only about 10% of those organisations is where the spend goes on defence. So it's become quite specialist. And I think that, to your point, Rachel, it kind of shows the shift in where innovation is coming from, and whether it's defence learning from the private sector, commercial sector, or the other way round. And there's a great opportunity now for the private sector and for defence to learn and benefit from all the investment that's gone into other sectors, and AI is a fantastic example of that. Quantum will be another one.
Mm-hmm. Thinking about the possibilities and opportunities for defence and recognising the shift that you both mentioned, and the fact that the UK has identified defence as an area for growth, why is that? What is the growth that we're predicting and seeing, and how is it boosting the economy, and what are those wider benefits of growth in defence?
I'm happy to see that the Strategic Defence Review has a focus on growth and jobs and skills, because as Duncan mentioned, there's been an atrophy of some skills or new skills that need to be developed, and we've had manpower issues in all of our militaries, recruitment problems, retention problems. So you need to find ways to sort of energize that and attract new talent and younger talent for these different jobs. But you can't always expect defense to have a material return. I often hear this term, defense investment. That makes it sound like I'm going to spend money on defense and there will be some sort of dividend. Absolutely wonderful if that's the case, but sometimes it's just a public good that you have to spend money on, and there won't be that return on investment. But I do think it's smart, particularly as we're asking our publics to spend more on defense, also relative to other things that they might care about, healthcare, education, to make sure that we're doing our best to maximize those returns as long as they line up with the real defense needs. We have a good example recently up in is it Barlow? In Barlow, the nuclear enterprise in the Ministry of Defense, Barrow, sorry, apologies. They are really investing in jobs and skills and the actual community. So I think I heard 40,000 jobs expected and more than 200 million in investment over the next decade, with investments including sort of healthcare centers and schools. So, defense can really re-energize communities if it's done correctly, but we can't overstate it.
And Duncan, what's your view on the private sector and businesses' role in that growth, particularly to Rachel's point around there not necessarily always being that tangible, clear return on investment, which is sought after in the private sector?
If you look at this from the people perspective and the jobs perspective for the UK, the types and nature of roles that jobs in defence create tend to be more high-tech, tend to be more highly paid jobs. So they are good for the economic growth of our nation. And yes, defence will buy some of that capability back, But another feature of the defence industrial strategy now is around export and supporting export. So jobs and things that we do in the UK being provided to other countries. You'd have seen recently Norway just purchasing 10 of our Type 26 destroyers. So shipbuilding's always been a really strong part of our nation, being an island for obvious reasons. But the Norwegians are buying that capability. The Australians are buying the same ships as well. So the opportunity to export as well as what we do locally and create the high value, high tech jobs will be really, really key to our industry moving forwards. And some of those jobs can then go on to support other sectors.
It's so interesting to hear about this and the growth that's sort of expected from it all. Rachel, are there any examples of countries who have successfully grown their defence on the same scale as the UK wants to? And is there anything we can learn from them?
I think you can't look at it in the aggregate. I think you have to look at different gains, because European countries, just by virtue of their size and the size of their populations, will not be able to scale like a country like India or the United States. So I think we need to look at some of the small wins and gains that have been made. So, in the case of, Denmark, a country that I know quite well, I think they've been very smart in terms of their investments in defense. So, social democratic government, it wasn't necessarily an easy argument with their publics. So much like the UK, they did focus on the skills and the jobs, and the export markets is an excellent point as well. They also made the case about societal resilience and everybody's role in that. So they, extended the length of conscription, so more people throughout a greater segment of society would have a connection to what defense was and what their role in contributing to that was. This idea of sort of investing and creating partnerships with different actors, bringing society along, making the defense investment and the jobs and the skills argument, I think all of those are elements of a successful strategy.
We've talked a little bit about the role of technology, but it would be great to hear some examples of technological innovations in defence, because an example that comes to my mind immediately is something like drones. But it would be great to hear some other examples, and maybe where those innovations have led to innovations in other sectors outside of defence as well.
I mentioned a few at the outset in terms of innovation, but even in the medical field, things like EpiPens and dealing with trauma in a kind of field situation, those innovations have come into the way we kind of treat people.
So interesting. I had no idea. Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Yeah, and you can understand why, because there's been the necessity to do that when you're in military operations. So there's some examples of areas that we've seen coming into broader society out of defence.
It reminds me of when we were doing an episode on space technology, and we all got very excited about the fact that Velcro is an invention
That's
from
right.
space tech.
Not necessarily something as cool as Velcro. Sure, we can't compete with that. But maybe just how we're pairing these more emerging technology solutions with more traditional platforms, because to some extent, defense has what it has in its arsenal, and it's not easy to divest yourself of that or completely change what you're doing. It has to be kind of an evolution over time. So as we've seen in Ukraine, there are interesting things happening in terms of pairing drones, for example, with humans and tanks and human intervention. So I think the chief of the defense staff here in the UK speaks about lethality and using emerging technology to at once increase the lethality of forces and minimize the damage to humans in your force. So the idea would be, you'd send out a reconnaissance drone or a drone robot that was able to do demining and look for landmines along the road, and that then minimizes the risk to soldiers who might have to go in and do either humanitarian intervention or search and rescue, whatever it may be. It doesn't even have to be sort of a hardcore military operation. Any sort of military mission, from the low end to the high end, the lives of men and women in uniform can be saved by these new technologies. And I think we'll see more of that. Even prosthetics, think about the changes in the sophistication of prosthetics after Iraq and Afghanistan, where we saw a lot of people lose limbs.
And Duncan, sort of successfully managing the adoption of new technologies is something we talk about a lot in the private sector because it's a challenge and something that the private sector is very familiar with. When we're talking about the use of AI and new technology with the defence sector, does it face those same challenges around adoption, and how can it overcome them?
It does, and just to build on Rachel's response just then, one of the key features moving forward is something called the digital targeting web, and that relies on the ability for us to kind of win on the battlefield around rapid decision making. And what that requires is the ability to connect all the different platforms and sensors and assets that we have out there and be able to get the data back and make decisions quickly. So that's where a lot of the investment is going to enable us to respond to that. So in terms of adoption, it's the same as the private sector, Lizzie. It's the technology is one thing, but you have to have the organisation and the ways of working set up for that to be adopted. And going back to the targeting web, unless we can kind of integrate all those components and have the processes and the people that work around them working in the right way, it's not going to have the effect that we want. So it's the same lessons that we learn and see in the private sector that need to be adopted in the public sector. And one of the additional complexities to that is we operate in allied forces, whether that's through NATO, so with other nations. So we've got to think about not just interoperability within our own Ministry of Defence here, but also with partner defence organisations to have the effect that we want when we're in the field.
And you have seen a growth in those types of innovation ecosystems to try to shake up the traditional ways of doing things. I think NATO has a strange acronym, DIANA,
right.
But essentially it's a defence innovation accelerator. So startups can come in around something like military medicine and almost compete with their new technologies. And then if they're successful, they get funding, and then they move on to further tests and competitions. And then if in the end it's a proven technology, it's then put out for procurement and acquisition. That's where it does tend to fall apart, though, when people are actually not just giving it the seed money, but have to make the decision to buy A instead of B.
Yes.
So I think that's where we have work to do.
Scaling any kind of innovation is, in the private sector or in defence is always a challenge. And Lizzie, I know you'll be familiar with Diana, something that we are engaged in, and you're part of the business is engaged in. So helping kind of scaling of innovation, particularly for the UK small businesses, that's where defence moving forwards needs to give the certainty, kind of the underpinning commitment for these technologies and innovations to scale and to be adopted and to be successful.
And I guess there's different stages, aren't there, of the technology? And I've learnt quite a bit in preparing for today and reading about the emerging innovation, which is very much sort of the early stages, and then the maturing technology like AI we've talked about, haven't we, and the scalable capabilities. So it's not just a case of there's this new thing and we're going to try and implement it. It's actually there's a whole spectrum of tech, from new ideas through to well-established technology which just needs to be scaled and rolled out. Looking for a way to make a difference while you shop? Well, with Scope you can. Scope is one of the national charities Deloitte supports as part of our social impact programme. Visiting any of Scope's retail stores or online shop helps to support their work to create an equal future for disabled people. Every pre-loved item purchased or donated funds Scope's vital services and helps keep millions of items out of landfills. It's good for people and it's good for the planet. Just visit scope.org.uk to find out more.
On a slightly different topic, but related to the challenges that defence is facing, ESG. What are the climate and sustainability concerns and how are they affecting defence? And have you seen a change in expectations in the defence sector kind of needing to operate more sustainably?
From my perspective, yes, and there is a defence sustainability strategy. It's something we kind of supported, helping develop a few years back. Given what's going on in the world, the focus on that, I think, is you have to kind of pick when to focus hard on that. But if you think about kind of operations, how can we take sustainable energy to frontline operations? What is the way in which we can do that? How can we use in the UK, more than 1% of the land is owned by government and the Ministry of Defence. How can we use that and the natural resources that exist there to generate energy sustainably? How can we benefit and use nuclear energy, so SMRs and AMRs that are being developed to power defence kind of capabilities and assets? How can we use that to kind of put back to the grid? So that is all being thought about, Annie, but it's a long journey, and it's a complicated journey because it's not, to Rachel's point, it's not just the Ministry of Defence that can drive this forward. It has to do it in concert with lots of other bits of government and the private sector to really make this work.
I mean, we saw the Department of Defense as, I mean, one of the biggest budget takers in the U.S. and one of the biggest users of land and fuel and other things has moved in this direction. Because if they adopt a technology like solar or sustainable fuels, it's almost like it's almost its own test bed and its own microcosm. There is an element of scale there if they become the main user of that. But again, it sort of goes back to the comment I made around defense investment, that yes, sometimes there will be a return. Yes, sometimes there will be an avenue for sustainability or testing these more sustainable technologies. But sometimes you really are just going to have to go for effect, because at the end of the day, it's people behind these machines. And if I'm an operator, I want to make sure that I've got the best kit, even if it's not necessarily, up to ESG standards. So there's a place for ESG, and when we're procuring or in particular producing things that haven't been produced before, let's produce with a mind to those standards.
Let's look about sort of into the future a little bit and what the plan might be. We've talked about a lot of opportunity and growth within the defence sector. So let's talk about how we get there. To realise all of this potential, there needs to be a lot of collaboration. We've talked about that between the public and private sectors. How can we do this successfully?
In my introduction, talked about the 2005 Defence Industrial Strategy. At the heart of this one is around kind of growth for the UK. As we know, it's one of the government's priority industrial growth pillars. So for me, I think it's about government and defence being clear what it wants to achieve and what it wants to get done. That then allows kind of the private sector and industry to invest properly, because there's that level of certainty there that they can kind of put their money behind. So reinforcing clarity on what we're trying to achieve and where we're going to put money in different parts of the UK, I think will be one key part of it. Another one would be for kind of the private industry or the private investor side to kind of come into the UK and invest in the businesses that are going to scale and start up. There's plenty of opportunity there for us to do that. I think there's a lot of appetite on the investment side in order to do that. Some of the challenges, to go back to the sustainability ESG question, that prevented institutional investors putting money into defence, those have kind of evolved, recognising the world that we live in today. So there's a much more open door now for private investment to come into defence, and that's going to be important in the short term as government funding in defence is rising, but it's not rising immediately. So that initial funding over the next few years from the private sector side is going to be important. So we're at a point now, Lizzie, where I think if we can get this right between government and the private sector side, including the investors, there's a real opportunity to drive that agenda forward. But clarity and commitment is going to be key.
I appreciate the point on investment because sometimes there's this. Why does NATO need 3.5%? Why all these metrics? Well, I mean, it's simply because without the input, there's not going to be any output, and that has to be sustained. I mean, Duncan made an important point about sending a long-term demand signal to industry, because you're not going to hire new workers and build a new factory if you're not sure that the demand is going to be there for 5, 10, 15 years. So I think that's important. And for a spender, you want those economies of scale and that mass, so it's more affordable and sustainable. What can the private sector do? I mean, I think there is an aspect we haven't talked about yet around regulation, particularly when we're talking about, more conventional defense platforms, standardization. There is a tendency, there has been a tendency, particularly in these years when, we weren't actually out there fighting, to create systems that were really bespoke. So you wouldn't just have one platform, you'd have one platform with all sorts of specifications for a specific country. That's actually not the most effective way either to procure things in an efficient way or to export it. So ideally you want sort of an open architecture system that people can then make bespoke later, but in order, again, to get those economies of scale, you need to kind of be a little bit more basic in what you're producing. If we then get into emerging tech and AI and whatnot, I look across the channel and I see the level of regulation that's happening in the European Union around technology, and I worry for those companies, particularly the small and medium-sized enterprises who are trying to scale and are trying to get their technologies off the ground and noticed, and the regulations are there before the technologies have even been tested. So I'm not saying that, the private sector should move out without any sort of guardrails, but it has to be a balance between actually fielding and learning from these technologies and regulating them responsibly.
That's really interesting that you've said regulation is in place before the technology is there, because sometimes it's the other way around, isn't it? So the tech is there and then the regulation can't keep up with the constantly evolving.
Yes. Well, the UK has a really interesting role there, because I think the European approach is regulate first, because that's, the EU is a regulatory body in many senses. Conversely, in the US, it's the private sector that tends to run things, and they just move out. They run fast and they break things, and then they ask for forgiveness later. And the UK, for me, is a bit in the middle of that conversation. So I think, particularly given the focus on fintech over recent weeks, but in both of those sectors, you can be kind of a moderating voice, both across the channel and across the Atlantic.
It's interesting because there is a role for regulation to play when we're thinking about future scaling, future innovation and growth. Like, how do we do that responsibly and encourage that responsible growth and innovation? And are the regulatory and legal frameworks that we have in place doing that in a balanced way?
Save the toughest questions for last. We don't know, right? Because things are changing so quickly all the time. We might think we have the right set of regulations, but then we see an incident where somebody's identity is stolen or something really terrible happens, and then we, just like the internet, we have to change our regulations and way of doing things. But unless we sort of move out and try these things, we'll never get that innovation, and we'll never know. But I do think it's this partnership between users, the private sector, and governments and international organizations to try to get that balance right. But it's going to be iterative.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the key thing around growth is enabling the private, the public and the investor sectors to actually do what they need to do. So removing things that get in the way of progress is going to be key for regulation. So I think you have to start with that kind of philosophy in what the regulators are putting in place to kind of help and manage the overall system. But it's a rapidly moving feast.
At RUSI, we have worked with technology companies and governments to create standards of conduct. So it's not necessarily rules, but it's sort of like, commandments or guardrails that people as users or innovators or producers of these technologies agree to abide by. And that's at least something that creates a common understanding within which you can develop that ecosystem of both innovation and regulations as you go forward.
And I mentioned before, speed of decision making is the advantage you want in this game now. So regulations that enable us to move at pace, whether be they procurement regulations or whatever, that's going to be really important for us to both the way we do defence, but also what we do in military operations. If we can get that right, we will get the advantage that we need.
A bit about people. So in a lot of our episodes, we touch on workforce and skills of the future, etc. And I'm sure that's the same in defence. And realising this growth that we've talked about is going to require a skilled workforce. Clearly, that's about retaining talent, but also attracting it. And what's sort of the current situation in defence, and how can the defence sector do that effectively, and sort of what are the types of skills that need to be developed?
There's plenty of skills in the country. I think the key bit is about attracting them and retaining them in the defence context. So since 2020, we've had 1.7 million engineering and computer science graduates come through in the UK. So we're not short of those, but getting those people attracted to the sector and working in the sector is the key bit to that. So I think we have to think about kind of the workforce and that being a little bit more dynamic and open. And we talk about zigzag careers. You're not kind of stovepiped in one particular pathway, and you have the ability to move your career through the public and the private sector in a way that's going to attract people to not being stuck necessarily in one particular space, and developing the skills that will give them the ability to move into different jobs, different roles, different organisations. So the skills do exist, but the key is how we get them and attract them and retain them in the whole defence ecosystem, which is why we need that kind of whole of society approach to drive defence forward in the UK.
And is that underway? Is that something that you're seeing materialise?
It is. There's things like the Defence Skills Passport, which is looking at a way to help mobility and flexibility in people's careers. That's one starting point. But I think there's work to do to kind of help and make it a lot easier for people to move into different roles within organisations and across organisations, and to make it easy to go from the private and the public sector, backwards and forwards. There's work to do there because it's not as fluid as it needs to be at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I like this concept of a zigzag career. As somebody who has a zigzag career, I'm glad to hear it's, again, on trend.
Back in trend.
It's a good point, because in the US, we act, and this may not be transferable in a UK or European context, but we have a very robust reserve force in the United States. So a lot of people will join the military, go to a certain level, major, captain, and then they'll get out. Yeah. So say get a job at Deloitte. But then they stay in the reserves, so once a month they go and they make sure they are kept up on their basic training and their skills. And society is kind of set up that they have the space to do that without prejudice. So they can't be held back from promotion because they're doing reserve duty. They have to be given the time off. And it's seen as sort of a net benefit, this skills transfer and this reserve aspect. Sweden has actually taken it a step further and said, not only will you not be penalized, you will actually get preference if you do your conscripted service and stay in the reserves. You get preference for university or job offers or internships. So again, it's about thinking about that bargain and how you see defense as part of society. So I think that's part of it as well, is normalizing the reserve forces and normalizing service.
Yes, well, I'm delighted that you're hearing the support for the reservists, because as a former platoon commander in my university officers training corps, I like to think that, I played my part during that time, as long as any war broke out on a Wednesday or at the weekend.
Just to build on your point, Rachel, we in the UK we do have that reserve, so there are actually a large number of reserves
Absolutely.
in Deloitte that carry on that commitment. And to go back to the zigzag career point, it's about the ability to dial up and dial down, kind of your commitment over time as befits your circumstances, your personal circumstances at the time, and that kind of flexibility is a key part to it.
Well, thank you both so much. It's been an incredibly fascinating conversation. I feel like I've learned a lot. I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot. So to wrap up the episode, it's time to answer the big question of the day. Do we need to think differently about defence? Duncan, I'll come to you first.
I think the short answer to that is yes. As we touched on, the peace dividend is over, and the stability that we've enjoyed is over, and the UK and Europe are just not in the position that we need to be in right now. So if we want to continue to live our lives the way we live them and enjoy the prosperity that we have to think about how we redo defence. And for me, there's probably three things. One, a real fundamental reformation of the capabilities that we need. So that's rebuilding capabilities and building the new capabilities, particularly the technology ones that we need. We need innovation, speed and agility to do that, in decision making in particular, both in the way we do our business, but also on the operational field. AI is going to be a catalyst and enabler of that, so we've got an opportunity to take that forward. And we need that whole of society approach and the uplift in kind of investment from the government side and the private sector side to enable and drive that. So for me, those are the three things. If we can get those right, we'll be in a good place.
You also get a yes from me. We absolutely need to think differently about defense, partially because the nature of the threats is changing. Again, it's not just military, it's military, economics, societal, information, all of these things are in the bucket of security. And then related to that, and Duncan already mentioned it, it is a whole of society approach. We used to say whole of government approach, but no, now it's whole of society. It's every citizen, it's private sector, it's public sector, it's think tanks. So absolutely need to think different about defense.
Thank you so much. Fantastic conversation. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We release a new episode every other Tuesday with another big question. So don't forget to hit follow or subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening or watching, and make sure your notifications are on, so that way you'll be alerted whenever a new episode drops. This podcast is produced by our very own Pod Squad, original music by Ali Barrett.